Okay, to start a storytelling section this evening.
Test. Test.
I'll give you mine.
Test it. Now it is.
To start this afternoon, I'm going to go around the room. I will introduce our panel, and then I'm going to let them start, give a little brief history of themselves, give a little bit of synopsis on their careers, and then I'm going to let them lead as to where, when they started in this industry, as to where we are in present, the changes that they've seen, and just let them reveal the good and the bad and the ugly of all. First, we have Mr. Ted Basset, Mr. John Williams, Dr. Chandler, and my esteemed friend Terence Collier. Mr. Basset, we'll start with you.
Good afternoon. I'm Ted Basset, 12. I have been privileged that Keeneland has tolerated me for about 44 years. And I couldn't help but be impressed of how attentive you were during the preceding lectures. And at the time, I was sort of looking up at this pavilion, and it's 45 years old this year. And it was designed by the famous architect Mark Forlick from Beverly Hills. And I just want to point out one thing. If you would look up here at the ceiling and these 6 mammoth beams, they were all constructed and cut in Washington and shipped across the country in 2 big freight cars that got lost in South Dakota. And took us about 10 days to locate them, and we were rushing to finish the pavilion for the July sale. A lot of happy memories in this facility. Some very good moments, some very sorry moments for some people. Over 600 horses sold for over $1 million. So I'll turn it back to you.
You, I do know as a past breeder, or past president of the Breeders' Cup, I do know that you hosted some Breeders' Cups through some pretty inclement times, hurricanes and forest fires. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, it's too bad we have to start out on a low moment here rather than a high moment, but in my times with the Breeders' Cup, the low ones were, I think, the 1990 distaff, where we had Go for One that broke down at the 16th pole. I happened to be sitting with Ron McAnally during that race, and he was the trainer of Bacola. And it was a very difficult time for everybody in the stand because of the breakdown right in front of the stands and the thrashing that Go for One went through. And as I led Ron McAnally down to the winner's circle, they started booing. And it was a very awkward moment because he had nothing to do, and Bacoa didn't with the tragic accident. But it was a very difficult time, and that is a sad moment for me. And as Wayne said, the other bad moments are low moments, whereas the weather ones, the hurricane we had in South Florida, that just stopped everything for about 2.5, 3 weeks. That several roofs blew off at Gulfstream. And then we had, in 1990, the Belmont, we had a monsoon Thursday before that washed the track out at the half-mile pole. But it recovered enough for Cigar's wonderful race that day that he won the mile and set a record. So the bad times are overwhelmed by many of the happy moments.
And to elaborate and get back a little bit to the sales scene and where we sit here today, you have certainly seen Keeneland evolve over the years into an international player in the sales game. Could you explain a little bit about your early days when you started on as a sales executive with Keeneland, how that progressed over the years and the changes that you've seen up until, where we are at present?
It hardly seems possible As I said, Keeneland has tolerated me for over 40 years. But the July sales were just something very magic. This pavilion here was incorporated in 1970, and there was just something about them. The world came here. We were sort of an international crossroads. And the interesting buyers from now we're selling to about 38 countries across the world. But those early days, the first $1 million horse we sold, $1.5 million, was a Nijinsky out of charming Alibi that we never thought we'd sell a horse for $1 million. And at this particular time, our famous auctioneer was George Swinebroad, who was a legendary man and brought up selling cattle and tobacco, and then developed what's called the Keeneland chant. And he died several months before this July sale. And Tom Caldwell, who is his legendary successor, and when he reached $1.5 million and knocked it down to the Burnett brothers from Canada, and he said, the horse is Canadian bound. And that was the name that they gave him. And he went on, he spent most of his time racing in Europe and brought back. And Charlie Whittingham took him under his guidance. And Charlie was one of the underbreeders of the $1.5 million. And the best he could do, he never won a maiden race. So it was sort of a sad ending. But many more historic ones that have come on of the 600 that we've sold, over $1 million in this building. And I'm sure the others here have many stories of their experience of either selling or buying.
And through all your years from here at Keeneland and relative to the sales, is there one humorous moment that sticks out in your memory?
Would you repeat that?
Would there be one humorous moment that sticks out in your memory?
The sad ones?
The funny ones.
Funniest number.
Oh, the funniest? Oh, my goodness. Well, I think probably one that George Swinebroad, as I spoke to you about, the legendary trainer who had a skin thicker than a rhinoceros, that nothing bothered him. And Charlie Richardson, who sat over here as one of the bid spotters, the legendary bid spotters also, said something to George, this fellow over here has got a problem. You better look after him, be careful. I said, what's the matter with him? He's drunk. Well, throw him out. And so, do you mean that? So he's leading the drunk up the aisle there. And George said, wait a minute. Has the guy got any money? Bring him back down here.
Those are great ones. We'll move on here to John Williams. John is a native Marylander, came to Kentucky, very instrumental, managed Spendthrift Farms, long-standing relationship with the Combs. Certainly learned the different dynamics from how you would syndicate a horse in Maryland, how the syndication progressed into the commercial marketplace, later a partner in the Eaton Williams sales agency. Both of these gentlemen were pioneers, and many of the things that are done on the sales grounds today as far as updates and the way horses are presented is attributed both to John and Lee. So, John, I'm going to let you take it from here, and you can give us a few of your insights on where this business, how you started and where it's originated, and where you think we are in good spots and where you think we might be in a low spot.
Thank you, Bane, and thanks to all of you for being here and putting up with all this gray hair up here. I guess I was 9 years old when I climbed on the first pony, belonged to a neighbor, and I don't think I've been away from a barn or some horse's stall since I was that 9-year-old boy. And I'm very grateful to the good Lord for putting me in a horse's stall because God knows what I'd do anywhere else. It's been a wonderful, magical ride for me, and I'm very proud of growing up in Maryland and working with some wonderful horsemen there, and then coming here to Kentucky and working with wonderful horsemen here. When I started in Maryland, I started on the race. I started at Pistorio Farm working as a groom and a weed eater, before weed eaters, weed hook, and then went to the racetrack. And my time on the racetrack was invaluable to me in learning horsemanship and learning the end use of what we breeders are all about. The time on the racetrack enriched my life. I learned how to care for a horse and work for a trainer that used to scream at me and say, "How can you put that pin other than vertical on that bandage? Do you know what this horse does? He feeds you." That kind of exposure to those kind of people and to platers and selling horses at Laurel and Pimlico and Bowie were very, very great experiences for me. Then when I was working for Helmore Farm, the owner, Edgar Lucas, asked me to become his farm manager. And at age 27, I was the youngest farm manager in Maryland. I knew nothing about farm management, but I learned as I went. And I had wonderful people that I could go to and ask questions. And that, I want to say that to all of you young people. Ask questions of people that you know have had those experiences. Believe me, all of us are happy to share that because we got it from the generation before us. And these things were wonderful times. Back in Maryland, we would syndicate horses and sell shares in horses to racing people that were primarily interested in raising race horses as opposed to sales horses. So it was a very different outlook. Every foal that I pulled out of a mare that belonged to Helmore Farm wound up getting a tack on them. No sales. It was a different mindset back then in the 60s. When I came to Kentucky and came here to manage Spendthrift Farm, we went from the modest backyard racing breeding farm to a huge commercial farm where the emphasis was on sale, the sale of shares. I'm still on. It was very, very commercial. Now, many of the clientele that Spendthrift had were also racing people, really wonderful people, Joe Roebling and the McMahons and so many great racing people. But the emphasis was on sales with all the horses that Mr. Combs had with what he called his partners, Cousin Combs and his partners, wound up in either this ring or the old ring with the old cane chairs. And George Swinebroad, he was a magnificent guy, as Mr. Basset was alluding to earlier. So it was a whole different deal here. I went from 185-acre, 2 farms in Maryland, one in Baltimore County, one in Howard County, to this 2,700, which was very much reduced at that time to 2,700 acres. We had as many as 600 mares at any given time. We'd foal 200 to 300 foals a year. We would sell 200 or more yearlings, and we would break up to 250 yearlings at the training center. During my time, we stood as many as 45 stallions, back-to-back Triple Crown winners, 2 other Derby winners, Majestic Prince and Proud Clarion, and we could bring out 2 others that were second in the Derby. It was a huge change from that little farm in Maryland. So these were great experiences. And when I left Spendthrift in 1984, my friend Lee Eaton, who was responsible for pushing me and coaxing me to leave Maryland to come to Kentucky, Lee and I formed a partnership, Eaton Williams, and it was a wonderful partnership. And at the time, we may have been one of the largest sales agents in the business. Now, if I compare that to some of the sales agents today, some of you out there, we were small, but at the time, that was a large agency. And we concentrated on what we had, our clients. We didn't look outside our fences. We tried to improve what we were doing within our realm and to take good care of these loyal clients. And loyalty in those days was tremendous. And people I see jumping from sales agent to sales agent for this deal or that deal, we were lucky that we didn't have to deal with that. We had wonderful loyal clientele, both sellers and buyers. I left my agency, sold my half of Eaton Williams in 1995, and when I had left Spendthrift in '84, I started my own farm, Ballindagan, with just 3 clients, but they were wonderful. Harborview, George Lehman's Forest Acres, and the Manganero family. And these people, with the exception of the Manganeros, we would sell horses, primarily sell their offspring. These others were, they were racehorse breeders. And to be associated with that kind of clientele was wonderful. And the sales agency, Lee and I were partners until 1995 when I sold my share in my 50% interest in the sales agency, started my own, and have remained with horses up to this day, but at a very, I said to you last year that I joined Broodmares Anonymous, so sold my last mare in this ring, but as Bill Landis said, he caught me out here looking at weanlings. We have 4 of us that are interested in buying some weanlings. He said, "Yeah, Williams, I see at your age, you're playing the short game now." So I still am involved with horses, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful journey.
Next, we'll introduce Dr. John Chandler. John, a native South African, went to vet school, later on to England, managed to meet his wife and Alice Chandler. They came here to establish Millridge Farm, and John, I will let you elaborate on your travels and your history into the bluegrass region.
Well, at the end of '66, I decided I would expand. I'd been working in England in a large horse practice for a long time, 2.5 years. And I bought a bus ticket in London, which enabled me to ride anywhere on a Greyhound bus for 99 days. And I said, well, that'll see me on my trip to America. I'll see it all in 99 days, and then I'll go on. I think I might go to Australia next. It's broadened my horizons. Anyway, I got on my Greyhound bus and I visited every state in the Union. I really did close to 20,000 miles in a Greyhound bus. And it was a very convenient place to sleep because you could go from one city to another and sleep overnight, and then it would save you all kinds of money with hotels and things like that. And you could make a bowl of chili with 2 handfuls of crackers, go a long time. I went to virtually every... I'd known some professional people, Bob Adams at Colorado State, and I knew Jack Bryans. I'd met them in England at various meetings, and so I was visiting mainly vet schools and practices, and he wound up here in Lexington and spent a lot of time riding with Ed Fallon. And when time came for me to move on, they said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm off to Australia." And they said, "Well, why don't you stay here a while longer? We'd like to offer you a job here at Haggard's." So I spent a couple of years working at Haggard's. Then I went back to South Africa. Meantime, I'd made a very close personal contact here in Lexington, who then came out to South Africa. We got married in South Africa and lived there for a year. And of course, I'm referring to my present wife and my first wife, Alice. And then we decided, after a year, with the political situation and the financial, Millridge was already going. We decided we'd come back and move back here permanently and build up Millridge. And after we were running working hard. I don't know if you know how closely my wife was involved with the horses, but we had 105 mares on the farm, and she was teasing them all herself. She would be out in the morning and teasing the mares and doing all that farm manager stuff. And then I eventually I had some good friends in England who were bloodstock agents who came out to the yearling sales here. One of the first was Ray Barnes, who was the first agent to come out regularly to the Keeneland sales here. And he said, "Would you vet some horses for me?" And I said, "Sure." I said, "No, nobody was vetting horses in those days. They didn't even walk them." It was very different to the way it is today. If you had a yearling, you would bring it out and stand it outside the stall, and the prospective buyers would walk around, have a look at it and say, "Thank you very much," and put it back in the stall. And Ray Barnes was the first one that said, "Would you give it a walk, please?" And the grooms would say, "What do you mean, give it a walk?" And they said, "Walk up and down." They said, "This crazy damn Englishman, he doesn't know what he's doing." And that was the first one who really did that on a regular basis. And then I started vetting horses for Prince Khalid bin Abdullah, and I met him at the Deauville sales in 1979, and I was on a retainer with him to do all his sale work, and we used to go to a lot of sales together. He used to go to a lot of sales those days. And then in 1982, he bought a farm here, and then reorganized his operation and expanded it here. And in 1985, I became the president of the corporation here, at which stage we owned about 600 odd acres of land, 550 to 600, and we started expanding then and bought more land locally, and on the other side of town, out in the Lemons Mill, and eventually Juddmonte is now about 3,000 odd acres. And well, that's sort of the story of me and Juddmonte. I remember practicing one of the things I said, Bain, while one of the clients I had as a person was a man called Joe Taylor, who was the manager of Gainesway then, and ran this breeding shed right up the road, which is now the entertainment center. That was the Gainesway breeding shed. And they had a horse there that was he wasn't a shy breeder, but his sperm only lived for 6 to 8 hours. And so Joe very brightly thought of breeding them as close to ovulation as possible, which entailed breeding them at midnight sometimes. And so clients would bring the mares to the farm, to the breeding shed, and leave them there during their cycle. And as the most junior in the practice, then I was the fall guy to go and palpate mares at midnight. And that's how all that midnight breeding madness started. And now it's more routine than irregular to breed that way. Joe was a very entrepreneurial fella. I mean, he had some great deals going all the time. He was a great horseman, raised a great bunch of kids who were obviously well known to everybody in the business. But Joe was the supreme man. He was very, very astute and knew when a deal was good and when a deal was bad. And I enjoyed being his friend and working with him on various projects over the years. John Williams was talking about his journey through horsemanship, and I remember Spendthrift before he came there, which was a large operation, just as large, but rather differently run. And then they brought these carpetbaggers in from Maryland, John Williams and Don Snellings and Steve Johnson and Rick Nichols, and they took over the farm, and it was all under the auspices of Linda, and they brought their own veterinarian in from Maryland, Dr. Witherspoon, and they turned the whole operation on its head. And so I still consider the Williamses and the Snellingses and those boys carpetbaggers.
Coming from you, that's pretty ripe.
Well, I had a couple of years residency on them.
We're still here.
Yeah, well, you've lasted well. You've lasted well. There's a whole bunch of other stories I could tell, but I don't really want to take up too much time on a personal note. I should imagine my being here I would owe to one person. That's Ed Fallon, who was one of the most skilled, one of the best veterinarians I'd met, and he took me under his wing and mentored me, and he was solely responsible for me being in the seat here today. There were a bunch of nice people at Haggett's those days. When I started at Haggett's, there were 11 of us in the practice, and I knew every van driver in Lexington. I knew every farm manager, and I think there was a total of maybe 19 equine veterinarians in Fayette, Scott, and Woodford County. There was the sum total of the equine veterinarians. And the veterinarians today are very spoiled because they hadn't quite invented a tranquilizer for horses yet, so we didn't even have anything like acepromazine. And practicing was a whole lot more exciting those days than it is today. Anyway, that's a brief. A lot of things I checked with my friends here before, and they said no, those are not the sort of stories that we can tell in this gathering. And so I'll let you have Terence now, who I wanted to tell you one story about Terence.
Please don't.
No, not that one, Terence. I remember when Terence came to town, he'd been up in New York, and he came down to work at Fasig Tipton, and he'd been here a day or two, and the local boys said, well, let's go and have lunch. And they went out to a place called Buffalo's. Now, in Lexington, there have been a number of really good lunch places. There used to be a place on West 2nd called Coyle's and Rogers Restaurant, but Buffalo's was a good, a very good place to have lunch. And the fellow Buffalo's girlfriend was the waitress, and Terence went there and said to her, "Or do you think I could see the wine list, please?" And she went into the back and said to Buffalo, "This is an English sucker here, wants a wine list." And Buffalo said, "What?" He said, "Wait a minute." He got a napkin and he wrote red on one side, he wrote white on the other, and he said, "You take that and you give that to him, and that's our wine list."
That's as true as it gets.
I always stay with the truth. It's a lot easier to remember. Anyway, I'll let you have Terence now.
You can hold on to that.
Oh, you've got your own?
Yeah.
I told him he was a lot more accustomed to amplified sound than I was.
Next, we're going to introduce Terence Collier of Basset. I don't think I could introduce anyone that's probably pulled more fun or had more enjoyment being in the horse business than Terence Collier. And I'm going to give you an open canvas because I don't know where to start.
Well, it's a great honor. I mean, first of all, with the exception of my friend Bain on the left, it's truly an honor to be here with these very distinguished members of the thoroughbred industry. And it's quite sobering, you know, when you finally get to be invited to become one of the legends. And every day I walk through Fasig-Tipton's doors, I realize I'm the oldest one in the company, and that's sobering enough, and it's a delight to be the youngest on this panel. I'm going to go around them one at a time and just give you a tiny story about each of them. Mr. Basset is probably responsible for me staying in the horse business. I started coming to Lexington in the late 60s, and in the very early 70s, I was introduced to him in his office here. He was a very new boy at Keeneland, and I think it would be fair to say that he was treated with about as much suspicion as I was when I first came to Lexington. He was an out-of-towner. He was not a natural horseman, and he certainly wasn't a hard boot. The one thing that he was and has always been in my life, he is the consummate gentleman, and he has been the face of Kentucky's breeding and racing industries for so many years, internationally and throughout the United States. And he welcomed me with open arms and encouraged me in everything I did, and I think without him I probably would have packed my bags and left a long time ago. And just to show you how friendly and down-to-earth he is, during the course of my son's education, we went up to his school up in Connecticut one year, and the headmaster there was talking about some of the very distinguished graduates of the school, and he mentioned, well, you're in the horse business, you'll probably run into somebody in due course called Mr. Ted Basset. And I said, oh, Mr. Basset, I know him well, absolutely. I've met him several times and know him well. So he said, well, you please say hello from Kent School to Mr. Basset next time you see him. Well, we did better than that. My son came down here one September, and the sales were on, and he said, you know, Dad, I've never seen a sale over at Keeneland. Would you mind taking me over there? And if we get a chance, I'd love to meet Mr. Basset. I said, well, you know, he's tied up in sales. He'll be very, very busy. So we came over here, and I walked into Ted's office, and of course there were 55 VIPs waiting to see them. And he said, hello, Terence, how are you doing? I'll be with you in 1 second. And so we got our turn, and I said, it's my son Julian, who is a student at Kent School, and he just wanted to say hello. Well, with that, Ted grabbed him by the arm and rushed him up to that very press box up there. And he said, this is Julian Collier, who didn't have some of the precociousness of his father, but and it was somewhat shy at being up there. And he said, this is Julian Collier, and his father, Terence, most of you will already know. Julian and I are going to sing the Kent School song for you. And Ted started it off, much to the amazement of Kent Hollingsworth. And away we went. But that was the start of a wonderful friendship that I've enjoyed all these years with Ted. And as always, it's a pleasure to be with you. John, I met in his early years at Spendthrift, and then we became more friends as he developed Eaton Williams, and I used to see him on a fairly regular basis during the Saratoga sales. And he was the man that helped Lee Eaton, who a dear man and a consummate professional, and they raised the form of customer service to an absolute art form. And in the latter years, when John was taking over many of the responsibilities that Lee had been in charge of for years, I remember one particular incident at Saratoga, and I was sitting in my office looking down in their inner courtyard when a fairly newcomer to the business, but a man with a huge wallet, walked into the courtyard, and Lee looked over, and there was a sort of blank look to his face. He knew the man was important, but he didn't know quite why or who he was. And I saw John standing in the corner see this go on, and John picked up a white folder and rushed over to Lee and sat down with him and turned to about page 20, and there they had the fact sheet on this gentleman. He had the names of his children, the names of his wife, his birthday, the color of the flowers that he liked, and Lee greeted this man, and this man thought Lee had known him for 25 years. And it was all because of John's hard work of putting those facts together that made Eaton Williams the professionals that they were. And now to my friend John Chandler. In those early years when I first arrived here, one of the few places other than Buffalo's to have a wine list was the Campbell House. And it was a regular spot for lunch. And I remember the very first time that I went to the Campbell House for lunch, very dark inside, bright sunshine outside. You go into this dark little hole, and had a hot brown for lunch. And I came out of there, and there was this impossibly long car. And I now know where he got it from, because he was obviously looking for something as big as a Greyhound bus, and that's what he used to drive around town. It was by far the biggest car I'd ever seen in my whole life. And there was Dr. John at the wheel there, ready to go off on his next round. And you won't, I know you'll believe it because you can still see it. He was one of the hottest young men in town. Good looking, strange accent, veterinarian, lot of charm, and he was the goods right here in town. Everybody wanted John Chandler on their dinner table. And it has been a friendship that's endured, despite the fact that one day when we were up at his farm, he very politely asked my wife if she would like to go to the back of the farm and see his cocks, but she did look at me twice, and I said, just go, you'll enjoy it. And then, last but not least, you were very shy in saying something about your beautiful wife, Alice, who I've known as many years as you almost, I think. And I think most of us will know that she was extremely determined and very forceful in her personality, and there was no nonsense about Alice. And as you said, she did everything on our horse farm that she could possibly do. I mean, she could lead a stallion into the breeding shed, she could foal a mare, she could do everything. I remember those wonderful days at Sariva and all of the great things that Alice has achieved in her lifetime. But I do remember you telling me the story about your year in South Africa, and the gentlemen in South Africa were never quite as tolerant of women as perhaps you wonderful people from Kentucky. And I think Alice said something one day, and it went totally over the head of everybody there, and nobody took any notice of her. And a few years later, we were wondering why John had this horse, who was a very, very talented racehorse. We often ask why people name horses certain things, and this one was called Tisab. And we didn't know whether to call him Tisab or Tisab or whatever. But, you know, he won a bunch of graded stakes, and so we really had to get used to saying his name. I mean, it was in the press, it was everything else. So why don't you tell us how that horse got his name?
This is South Africa, baby.
That's what he told Alice when she said, "Why is nobody taking any notice of me? This is South Africa, baby." So I'm going to turn it back over to the panel. This thoroughbred industry has been the joy of my life. I've met most of my good friends through it, and I feel somewhat of an imposter being on this panel with so many very distinguished achievers, but it's been a wonderful ride.
With that, I would just like to add, as I sit here and where I am in my career today, each and every one of these gentlemen sitting to my right has had some influence in the decisions I've made, where I have ended up, and I would like to say thank you to all of you. It's been a great experience. So with that. Unless there's any further comments, Mr. Basset?
I was spellbound by Terence. As we go back through the years of the competition between Fasig-Tipton and Kentucky and Keeneland, when I first came aboard as not only a greenhorn, but somebody with 3 left feet, and John Finney, the head of Fasig-Tipton, was so much more knowledgeable and experienced and worldly. And I can't help but feel all through the years of as competitive as we were in those days, that the wonderful leadership that they've had in Fasig, and I go back to John, and then when we opened this pavilion 45 years ago, the first person that we assigned reserve seats to was Humphrey Finney. Because Humphrey Finney took me, a greenhorn, and you built a new pavilion the year before, and asked me, come in and say, where would you like to sit? And Humphrey Finney got the first 2 seats, 8 rows up on the aisle, and then John inherited those. But another story about Fasig and the leadership was D.G. Van Cleet. And when I was asked to go over to the Breeders' Cup, which was a wonderful opportunity for me, Will Farish called D.G. and said, the Bassett's coming over. And so I walked in the office, and I didn't really know anyone in there. And I went into D.G.'s office, and here were all these sort of books and papers and memorabilia on his desk. And my first thought, my God, I hope he's not quitting because I'm coming over here. And I said, D.G., I'd known him slightly. I knew his father well. I said, what are you doing? Well, Will Farish told me to make room for you and find you take this office. And I took a deep breath and I said, God, D.G., put those goddamn things back in those drawers. This place needs you a lot more than me. I'll find a place somewhere. But we had the most wonderful friendship and relationship through the years with him. It's really been a pleasure, and we're lucky to have Walt Robertson here with us, and what a fine person he is. But as competitive as it was, we always had great respect for your operation and the friendships that we followed, and I wouldn't. And Terence, you've been like a beacon in a fog. It's been great to see you over there. John, your turn.
Well, I'd like to tell a couple little stories at my time at Spendthrift. But first of all, I'd like to say how much of a wonderful learning experience it has been for me in these 37 years in Kentucky. When I came here, I thought I knew about all I needed to know in the horse business. When I was interviewed for the first time by Brownell Combs, he said to me, well, now, look, what makes you think that you could be managing a 185-acre farm in Maryland and come here and manage a farm such as this? I said, Mr. Combs, it's just a multiple of what I've been doing. So I was a little cocky. But I tell you, it was a humbling experience to find out how much I needed to know when I came here. I have been learning ever since. And I encourage all of you to have an open mind. And if you love the horse, primarily, if you love the horse, first and foremost, try to learn all you can about him and the people that have had the experience of caring for them properly for a number of years. I listened to a little bit of the symposium, the veterinarian panel, and sesamoiditis, and now we're going to have to do ultrasounds of sesamoids, and the way this thing has changed, the changes that we have seen to try to protect the buyer. These are good things. It's made it more difficult for us as breeders, but these are good things. The repository that has come on board since I have been here in Kentucky has been a boon. It's almost eliminated post-sale arguments. It's been wonderful. On the other hand, it has caused potential buyers to lose potentially good racehorses. So it's a fine line there. The changes that I have seen since I've been in Kentucky, when I first came here, and even especially in Maryland, buyers of horses, the people that it weren't horsemen themselves, relied on their trainers to select the horses. And this is something that I've seen gradually decrease at the sales. The trainers were responsible for selecting a horse, and they carried the weight of that selection and that advice on their shoulders. They had to prove what they advised, as opposed to agents that would buy these horses, and the trainers, they'd screw them up, right? Sure wasn't the agent. These things have changed. The multiple ownership started by Cott Campbell, I think have been wonderful things that brought more people into racing and into this business. And then those people have gone on to become breeders themselves, and then salespeople as well. That's been a wonderful thing. The things that have stayed the same, I think, are the wonderful farms that have great history and reputations of breeding good, sound racehorses and taking care of their clients, some for as many as 100 years. These have not changed, these solid farms. The people that used to own horses to race back in my home state, they raced them all if they could race. I see, and they were enthusiastic racing owners. I see that continuing and even growing with the new owners today. This fellow Rapoli, he does handstands when his horse goes over the wire. The enthusiasm is there. Mr. Plank, who saved Sagamore back in my home state, the enthusiasm that he has for this game, these racing owners have the same, maybe not the same, but similar enthusiasm for the game that the old guard used to have in the old days. So these are good things. I would like to see a return to the horsemanship at sales. I have a hard time looking at a yearling, and sometimes even weanlings, with a chain over their upper lip. He's got his head in the air. He can't drop his head and use himself the way I'd like to see him done. And I wonder why that is today, instead of a shiftney properly fit in his mouth, or even a chain looped in the ring of his halter. A halter that ought to fit him. It's the only piece of clothing he wears, you know. And I'm seeing halters down there by their nose or up there around their eyes. Manes that aren't pulled evenly. Horses that don't look fit for sale. These things I'd like to see changed, and I think gradually it's happening, but and it's only common human nature to be resistant to change, but hopefully those things will happen. Now, I'd like to tell one funny story about my old boss, Leslie Combs. And many of you in this audience never met Mr. Combs, but he was a piece of work. He was a consummate salesman. He was the father of modern-day syndication. He syndicated Nashua back in 1956 for $1,252,200. What an odd number. But he had a little something going there. This man was amazing. So he had, I first came to Spendthrift, and he'd get on his phone. We had two-way radios in all our cars, you know, and he'd say, Unit 1 to Unit 3, and I was Unit 3. Well, I couldn't grab that microphone fast enough. Yes, sir, Mr. Combs? Can you meet me down at Barn 2 at 1 o'clock? I said, yes, sir, Mr. Combs, I'll be there. So at 1 o'clock sharp, he starts down. Now, I'd already been there at 12:30 because I thought I was on Lombardi time. And he comes down from his house, and he says, you got any oats in that barn? I said, yes, sir. Sure, I got oats in that barn. He said, well, I'm going to tell you what I want you to do. I'm having a party tonight, and I always have a party before the July sale. And boy, I'm telling you what, I missed the July sale. That was magic. And he said, I'll tell you what. Now, I want you to turn those fillies. We kept the fillies in barn too. I want you to turn those fillies out there in my front yard. Well, his front yard was 60-acre field. And it was right in front of that mansion and that swimming pool and that pavilion he had where he had his party. He said, but before you do that, I want you to get those guys and take a little pile of oats and you put them there on that ridge. And then another little pile of oats and put them next there. And then along that ridge, I want you to put, how many fields you got there? I said, I only put 12 out in this one field, Mr. Combs. Well, I want you to put 13 piles of oats out there. And I want you to lead them out there up to the oats. Don't you let them turn them loose at the gate. I want you to lead them up there. And then when they start coming in, this is 7 o'clock, all those little bunny rabbits, and he called all the women bunny rabbits. He said, all those little bunny rabbits say, well, Leslie, how do you get all those fillies to be grazing right up here in front of your party like that? That's beautiful. He said, I sell a lot of horses that way, John. I said, Mr. Combs, I've only been here 3 months, and already I got one of your secrets. He said, yeah, boy, that's the way I'm going to let you have them. One at a time. One quick one. The second most colorful guy at the farm was probably the best guy that ever had a stud shank in his hand, in my opinion. His name was Clem Brooks. Most of you never saw Clem, never heard of him. But he took care of Nashua among 3 other horses. And Nashua, to this day, and I've been around, blessed to have had my hands on a lot of good horses. Nashua is the benchmark for me. And so Clem Brooks was his longtime groom. And he was up there at the stud barn, and Mr. Combs had come up, and Clem had just taken a group of people around to a tour of what was called the Nashua Motel. And there were some wonderful horses there. And he had given this guy a horseshoe. And so as they leave, Mr. Combs goes up and says, Clem, I know you've been selling shoes to these people, these guests, and I heard you getting up to $5 a piece for them. Now, and saying that they were on Nashua and getting that $5. Now, if all those shoes that you sold were on Nashua, he had to be a centipede. And Clem says, "Now, Mr. Combs, I never said the shoes was on Nashua. I said they was off of him." Thank y'all.
Come on, John, you have to do one more.
You think that'll work? I think he's a hard act to follow. I was going to tell some little personal story about Millridge Farm. And it had to do with John, actually. I had a very good friend in England who had 2 sons and who got into the horse business, the younger of which got in the horse business and went around and worked at various places around the world. And one day I had a call at Millridge, and it was this young man. He was a young man, I suppose. He wasn't a lad, but he was a young man, and he said, "I've got a problem." He said, I'd come from, he was English, obviously. I'd come from England, and they had, somebody had organized a job for me at Spendthrift Farm. And I got here, and there was a snowstorm on, and they told me, "There's been a change, I'm afraid, and the position here is no longer open." And he said, "You know, I'm stuck here. I just got here from England. You know, could you help me?" And I said, "Well, that's no problem." I said, "You know, if you stuck, you just got to Lexington." He was staying with Steve Johnson. He spent the night with him. He said, "Well, you know, you can come over to Millridge here and work for a little while, a month, you know, until you get yourself sorted out, and we get you sorted out." And he said, "Oh, it'll be fine, thank you." He said, "Seeing as how Spendthrift doesn't want me, I'll be pleased to come over there. Thank you very much." And I put the phone down, and I turned to my wife, and I said, "I've got this English boy. He's the son of a very good friend of mine that was very good to me when I was in England. And I've said he can come and work at the farm." And Alice said to me, "Oh, no, not another bloody Englishman." Anyway, the boy stayed on there, and it's been 37 years now. His name's Duncan MacDonald, and he's been with us for 37 years. We haven't got him settled anywhere else yet, so we just decided to stay. As everybody in the business knows, one of the lowest key, but one of the best horsemen there is in this business. And that's the story about Duncan. And thanks to John Williams for not hiring him.
I hope that Walt Robertson didn't think he was going to get away here scot-free, as you'll excuse me with his middle name. I've had the pleasure of working with the very best auctioneers in the world, and it would be remiss of me to say that the likes of Ralph Rettler and Laddie Dance and Walt Robertson in my career have really helped me in my role as an announcer, and none more than Walt. In the early years, one of my guiding counselors was a man that some of you will remember as Larry Enzer, a truly wonderful man and a good horseman and an all-round fine fella. And he tolerated me for a long time as his assistant, shortly after Rick Waldman, who was his first assistant, left him. And I filled in that role. And we had a lot of people in there. Mike Barnett, he was one of our Fasig-Tipton people. Fred Seitz down here, D.G. Van Cleef, and Rick Waldman, of course. So we've had a lot of very distinguished people through there. But my role evolved after Bill Graves joined the company. He was being led into the role of our leading inspector. And he and Walt spent a lot of time looking at yearlings and 2-year-olds for Fasig-Tipton. And Larry was coming towards the end of his career, And so he had to tolerate these two young upstarts that used to go down to Ocala and lead him around by the ear, looking at all these horses that he wasn't that keen on looking at anyway. So he arrived down in Ocala one evening, and they'd had a long day, and they walked into the Hilton Hotel there, and there was a little bit of a line to check in, and Larry was standing in this spot there behind a rope, and this little lady bustled her way in and elbowed past Larry, knocked his bag over, and stood right in front of him. And the man said, "Next," and she ran up to the counter, and Larry, who was looking for his first scotch and getting into his room, he said, "Excuse me, madam, but I was here before you." And she said, "Oh, no, you weren't." And he said, "Oh, yes, I was, and I've been standing here for 10 minutes. And she looked around, and her husband was there, and she said, "Herman, could you come over here and sort this man out?" And Larry sort of puffed his chest up a little bit, and he said, "Herman, you better not get over here and get involved in this fight, because it's one you're going to lose." And so Larry wandered up to the desk and signed himself in, and away they go. Well, the next morning they had a little bit of light breakfast, and Walt and Bill usually sat in the front of the car, and Walt was responsible for navigating, Bill was responsible for driving, and Larry just sat on the back seat and read his newspaper waiting for the first stop. So after about 10 minutes, they drove through these gates and pulled up at this house, and Larry's expecting to see some black plank fencing and some horses, and he looks around and he doesn't see anything that he recognizes. And he says, "What the hell are you guys doing now? What on earth are we doing here?" And it was the Ocala Old Folks Home. And Walt said to him, "Well, Larry, we thought you'd like to come up here and try kicking a little more ass."
Ladies and gentlemen, we certainly have four pillars of our industry. I hope tonight that you will send them off with a rounding applause for sharing some of their stories with us today. Thank you very much.
And of course, I missed my good friend Craig Bandroff, who was one of our most valuable people in the whole team. My apologies, Mr. Bandroff.
Keep it straight more than once, Mr. Collier. We won't tell them the stories we know about each other.
You'll say some closing words.
Well, that was a treat. I think I just want to thank the committee again. Bane, I handed you that. Just open that up for me.
Trouble when you get old. Would you like me to read it?
Here, Collier, hold that. Anyway, I think the members of this committee just did an awesome job. It's been a great day, from education and fun, and Callan Strauss and Martha J. Mulholland, Pat Costello, Jody Huckabee, Wayne Sweezy, and I'd really be remiss if I didn't thank Nicole Gibson. She's really the glue that keeps this whole organization together. And thank you all for coming, and I think we have refreshments in the bar.